Welcome again to Coastal Matters. I'm Charlie Walters. This is a monthly production of the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy in association with Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. My guest today is Rita Higgins, who in April of 2017 was elected to the Nantucket Board of Selectmen. It was the first time she had ever run for political office. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
What made you decide to run?
It was a combination of things going on at a higher national level and feeling like if there's things that you want to see be done differently, then you have to jump in and be a part of the conversation and be a part of that change. I also felt that where I could have the most impact and be most effective would be locally. And I felt that in terms of defining a vision for Nantucket, it was really important, based on what the island's facing today, it's really important to have a multi-generational board and to have someone who's dealing with the impacts of the housing situation day to day. And as well, even just the background where I see the island is really, we're growing, and my background is at that perfect point in time when my background seems to suit the issues, the housing, the environment, the development, suits the issues. So it was a good time for me to run.
You used a campaign slogan, for lack of a better term, which was a voice for home. What do you mean by that?
A voice for home, it's multifaceted. For me, it had two components. One is Nantucket, the island is home. There's a lot of islanders, there's a lot of people who've been coming out to Nantucket who feel that the island is changing, and it's changing in a way where you're either faced with a situation where you can't call it home because of the housing situation, or you're not sure if you want to call it home because of the way that it's changing. And for me, I wanted to, again, be representative of the people who aren't always able to call it home or can't consider it home because they can't see how they'll be able to stay here in the long term, but also look at how Nantucket is going to change and how it develops in the future, where it's a place that we all want to call home.
When I first moved here in 1971, what was then the summer population is now the winter population, the same figure, which I find staggering. Mm-hmm. Nantucket's continuing to grow in population. Cape Cod is actually shrinking, which I also find astounding. But you talk about smart growth. Mm-hmm. Describe your idea of smart growth.
For me, smart growth, when I said smart growth, there are many people that said, well, we're very strategic in our growth and we're planning for growth. But I don't think that the one element that is missing that would make our growth smart is understanding the environmental impact. Because you really do have, the more people you have, the more of an environmental impact you have. And I think we've got this seasonal situation where we're a small rural island most of the year. The influx of summer people means that we have to build our infrastructure and understand the environmental impact of that seasonality. We have to understand that down to a T in order to build the infrastructure for that. And to me, smart growth is also not growth for the sake of growth, because all growth is not necessarily good, but really saying, this is how we see ourselves growing, this is where we see ourselves growing, and this is how we're going to do it. And I don't really see, I see, plans for the future and sort of concepts of what Nantucket would be like, but not a sense that there's a defined vision of where we're going. And again, I absolutely see the environment being a missing component of that growth, the plan for growth. And I think to be smart growth, you have to include the environment and understand the environmental impact of growth.
So what you're saying, by extension, is growth isn't automatically bad, but badly managed growth is. Where do you see Nantucket in 10 or 15 years? Or 20 or 25 years? I don't have an answer to that either.
Yeah. I think, and this kind of goes back to your very first question about why I ran, is I think that I don't exactly know, and I don't think it's necessarily me to decide, but I think many people right now feel like they don't know, where I think in years past, up until now, we felt like we kind of knew what Nantucket was going to be in 20 years. And I think it's become such a big question for so many people. The role I would like to play is really getting everyone's thoughts together and making that a focus for the town to understand what it'll be like. Because I think right now there's a vision, a concern that, you know, we will be seasonally driven and everyone working here will end up being commuters. And that's not a vision that I would have for Nantucket. I think that at the very, you know, in the very basic vision, it would be a thriving year-round community, much like we have been, not a commuting community, but being able to provide for seasonal residents and also year-round residents on the island and have the services that we need.
Well, the argument for affordable housing is obvious. You've got people living in appalling conditions down here. But somebody on the other side might say, well, at least we're not having to provide services for them if they're commuting. So there are good and bad aspects of both, and I don't have an answer either.
Yeah. I think that comes back to, again, you know, who are we as Nantucket? Are we a community that provides for the island as a community, or are we a community that's driven by economics and market? And I think, you know, the market-driven Nantucket economy would suggest that if people are willing to pay for houses at this price and other people can't afford it, but they can commute, they're willing to commute from off island, then that's where we go. And, you know, I would counter that with saying that I think that we have a strong community and we have the opportunity to say that's not where we want to be. When it comes to affordable housing, I think if we aren't able through the market to allow for if the market doesn't allow there to be affordable housing for your middle class and your lower middle class and your lower income, people who are providing year-round services and seasonal services, then I think you just really do lose your sense of community.
Well, another argument against having such a large commuting workforce is, think of all the money that those people are making on Nantucket, and hardly any of it gets spent on Nantucket. It's just taking money away. It's providing jobs and work gets done, but a huge amount of money just does not get spent here.
Yeah. I guess, you know, a community economy for many reasons doesn't make sense, whether it's, like you said, the money isn't being spent back on the island. The costs, the ferries, the flights, and the loss of a dynamic community. I think all of those, to me, a majority commuting Nantucket doesn't make sense. And I think there's a lot of people that don't, people who are commuting now, they don't want to do that. And I think that, you know, if the economy picks up elsewhere, they'll make the decision to not do it. So I do think, you know, 20 years, if it was a commuting island, it might work for a bit, but will it work for another 10, 15? Or do we just have people who no longer want to commute? They have better opportunity elsewhere. Quality of life is better, and decide not to do it. Your
interest in the environment goes back at least as far as your college days. Tell us about what you majored in.
Yeah, it was during the campaign. It was kind of funny because I told people I've come full circle. I started out in political science, and after 6 months of political science, decided that I wanted to focus more specifically on the environment, and I switched into environmental studies and international development. So again, looking at that time it was focused on, and throughout my college years, I was focused on, in developing countries, the impact of development projects on the environment, and bringing those two more into alignment and not necessarily adversarial to each other, but complementary.
Now, your work as an environmentally conscious selectman is informed by your livelihood.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so my main business is landscape design, and I started out during college. I was working more in forestry, and I went in a bit naively, thinking that planting trees and things and working in forestry was going to be, one way of sort of decreasing our environmental footprint. But forestry itself is actually, you're working for paper companies, and what I really started to realize is what we were replacing was really nothing compared to what had been taken away. And that's when I really became more interested in biodiversity, ecology, that developed into an interest in green building and green infrastructure. So I ended up out on Nantucket working for another landscaper, fell in love with landscape design, but was sort of segueing into green roofing, which is plants on rooftops. And that was that green building, green infrastructure, design and planting. And that's ultimately what took me away from Nantucket for a couple of years. I was looking for somewhere, really urban areas is where that's happening, where the environment and development and building is most exacerbated. So I moved off, went into green roofing, focused on green roofing, realized I'm not a city girl, and I don't like living in urban areas, and ended up back on Nantucket and applying the principles of biodiversity, green building at the residential landscape scale.
How much green roofing is there on Nantucket?
None. I'm in the wrong place
None
for
at
green
all.
roofing. No, there might be a
Really?
mailbox green roofed.
And why is that?
Largely HDC. It would be initially would be a major obstacle. One of their most, where a green roof has some of the most impact is on a flat roof. And maybe if I had moved back a couple of years earlier, the hospital and the new school would have some green roofs. That would help overcome the HDC obstacle because you wouldn't see it from the ground. But in hospital situations and school situations, having that view over a green space instead of, blacktop roof or even white roofing makes a huge difference. Concentration levels, recuperation, speeds, things like that.
If something can't be seen from a public way, that gives a landowner many more choices. And there are a lot of houses on Nantucket that cannot be seen from any public way.
Yeah,
so in theory, at least, a lot of people could be utilizing green roofs if they so desired.
You're right. Anywhere it couldn't be seen, it would be the most possible. And they do. So one of the things that I loved about green roofs is that particularly when you have a pitched roof, so a pitched roof green roof is going to be a little bit more expensive. There's a little more engineering that goes into keeping soil and plants on a roof when there's a pitch. But when you're looking at stormwater management, the higher the pitch, the faster stormwater comes off the roof. And the faster stormwater comes off a roof, the more likely are you to have flooding and pollution because the water's traveling faster, so it's picking up more pollutants and carrying more pollutants as it goes. So when you have green roofs on a pitched roof, which would be the most common roof on Nantucket, you're actually able to have a significant impact on stormwater.
This show is, of course, called Coastal Matters. But what happens inland on Nantucket has a great effect on what happens on the coast. And you as a landscaper know more about this than most of us. Yep. So talk to us about fertilizer and that sort of thing.
Well, fertilizer, I will say, before sort of jumping into the nitty-gritty of it, is that the work the town and land council and the different organizations have done on defining fertilizer regulations and then enforcing them, we've made a lot of headway. And I think this year there were almost no fines. And I was actually, so I don't fertilize as a landscaper, I don't fertilize. I believe in building your soil and planting the right plant in the right place so that you don't need fertilizer. If you need fertilizer, then I consider that I haven't done my job. As a professional, I've put the wrong plant I've put the plant in the wrong place. But I was stopped on Main Street by someone from the Board of Health who was in a very friendly way just asking if I was fertilizing, what I was putting down, if I had the licenses and needed. So I do think we've made a lot of headway, but fertilizer is a major, major problem. And it really is, it comes down to application, the timing, the amount, the type. And I personally advocate for reducing lawn as the best strategy because a mowed lawn, a maintained lawn needs fertilizer at some point. Even organic lawns need fertilizer.
And that stuff will end up in the harbor, and that doesn't help eelgrass,
no,
et cetera, et cetera. It snowballs. Yeah,
and not just eelgrass. I think eelgrass and scallops are, the eelgrass is a great indicator, and scallops are sort of like the World Wildlife Federation's equivalent of a panda. It's something that we can all connect with, and we don't want scallops to disappear, and therefore we don't want eelgrass to disappear. But there's so much more that is being impacted and affected by the nitrogen that we can't see, the nitrogen and the phosphorus, that we really have to understand that it goes beyond the eelgrass and the scallops, and that repairing damage, especially when we can't understand or see all those moving parts, everything that's going on, in terms of the ecological processes, when you add more nitrogen and phosphorus, we don't know how well we can restore and repair. So I think reducing, and I do think the best approach is just, I love lawn, I love running around on lawn, but, being realistic about how much lawn you actually need and use, and trying to convert anything in excess of that into, ideally, some sort of native buffer.
You mentioned enforcement. Mm-hmm. How do you go about enforcing this sort of thing?
I think enforcement, well, the town's been doing it where they've been going around and looking for landscapers and asking, do you have, if you're putting down fertilizer, do you have a permit? I think there has to be some sort of self-regulation or within the industry as well. But when it comes to enforcement, I think the town has limited resources. I think I'm always an advocate for incentivization. And I don't necessarily have the answers to how we do that, but we have to get everyone on board, from the homeowner down to the landscaper, understanding the impact of what they're doing and providing some sort of incentive to not fertilize your lawn or to not have a high maintenance lawn.
Well, fertilizing is going on in a lawn. Is it the landscaper's responsibility? Is it the property owner's? If it's a renter and a renter calls up a landscaper, who is ultimately responsible here?
For me, I think I think it depends on, the landscapers are responsible for professional standards, for fertilizing, for doing their work professionally. But I think that it all comes down to the homeowner and the property owner, and that if there can be attention put on incentivization for property owners and homeowners to understand what the impact of lawns are having on Nantucket's ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, I think will be more effective than just simply regulating and enforcing on the landscapers' end.
This also affects the ponds. It's not just the harbor, it's not just Nantucket Sound and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Is it more of a problem with the ponds? I mean, we don't have huge ponds here, but we certainly have plenty of them.
I think that, I don't know enough of the science about pond ecology, but I would say that ponds are more vulnerable because in a lot of situations, as they close up, as there's less water, as there's less oxygen, as there's less natural processes, they really rely on us. I think the ocean has the ability to flush things and move things around more easily. A pond just chokes itself and dies, whereas the ocean has the ability, just through its vastness, to adjust. But I think we also lose, it also has the ability to transport nutrients and pollutants farther so that we have less of an understanding exactly what the impact is. And ponds, I think there's even more human intervention needed to restore a pond once they're degraded.
Sewers. Obviously, sewers are a way of dealing with some of the things you're talking about now. But the cost of a sewer can be astronomical. Yeah. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think that when we look at the cost of the sewers, I think that, we can say, the Nantucket sewer, I believe, was in the 80 million range. It's huge. But in some way, shape, or form, if there's nitrogen, phosphorus going into, excessive nitrogen, phosphorus going into the ground from septic or from lawns or from wherever else, there's still a cost. Again, this goes back to there's an environmental and social cost to that we're not accounting for. So I think that on one hand, 80 million, it's easy to put a price on labor and materials, but I don't think we're not really offsetting it with an understanding of what the environmental costs are if we don't do anything. And I think you can look at what is the environmental cost of losing scallops or losing all our eelgrass or affecting our drinking water. It has to surpass 80 million, or at least be somewhere in there if we were to do the math and put numbers on the environmental cost. I think we have to be very careful about one answer or one solution. I think again, this goes back to growth and understanding the capacity that we have now with our wastewater facility and sewering the whole island. Are we taking nitrogen, are we making sure that septic systems aren't leaching nitrogen, phosphorus into the soils and the water, yes, but is having everything stored, what's the cost and the impact of that? I don't know that it's necessarily the best answer either. And I think it also goes back to, again, enforcement and regulation. One of the things that I think is most important for Nantucket right now is testing our wells, because I think using that data to understand where our nutrients, where our pollutants are coming from. Right now we're using sort of a standard assessment of 60% is coming from septic, 16% is stormwater management, and other numbers, fertilizer, runoff, all fall into that 100% where your pollutants are coming from. But we don't know until we do our own data collection and analyze our own data. It's difficult to know where we should go next. Is it sewer? Is it more fertilizer control? Is it lawn reduction? Is it, septic systems, better septic systems? Until we have our own information, we don't know. And I think when it comes to enforcement and regulation, I think we really need to find a way to get all the wells in Nantucket tested, because that is the key to how we decide where we're going to be spending our money.
Getting back to the ponds, some ponds get tested sometime, but my guess is that the vast majority of the ponds, and a lot of them are smaller than the room we're sitting in right now, don't get tested. Should we be testing all the ponds?
Absolutely. Again, it will inform, coming from sort of now a government role, good data leads to good policy. So I think if we have, the more data we have, and I think particularly when it comes to water, timing is essential, because what happens if there's a rainstorm and it may be within the time of year when you can be fertilizing lawns, someone fertilized the day before, there's now a rainstorm the next day, how does the pond react the day after, immediately after, 3 days after, 5 days after? That's the kind of information that, in a perfect scenario, we'd be able to have that information to understand what's really going on. And we'd be able to connect the dots and, again, ultimately make better policy. And
those pollutants would show up, I assume, right away.
Well, again, if they're on the surface because they haven't been brought into the roots yet. So if a rain event happens immediately after fertilization, is when you're most likely to have pollution coming from runoff. Versus if it rains 10 days after, in theory, and again, in theory, it should be very different. But unless we're testing the ponds, we don't necessarily know.
And of course, if you're a tourist or a summer visitor, and you become aware that all is not as it should be with Nantucket's environment, you're going to think twice, perhaps, about coming back here sometime. So there's that element also.
Yeah, and I think that, again, it comes down to expectations and going either way. I think there's some people that come here, and if we were to start, planting more natives and it was less shrubby and there wasn't a perfect lawn, there are some people that might say, I expect in Nantucket to have this immaculate lawn. I don't want to come here. On the other side, if people feel like we're losing that sense of, that Nantucket has such amazing natural beauty, and there's a sense of being away from the mainland and away from things. And I think that sort of essence of Nantucket is away from everything that's going on in the mainland is what brings a lot of tourists here. And if we destroy that, then I do think it becomes less desirable. We sort of shoot ourselves in the foot as a tourist island.
You touched on non-native species a few minutes ago, and there are parts of the island that, to me, as someone who's been here a long time, are unrecognizable compared to what they used to be, because there are so many non-native plants that have been planted. I don't think you'll ever see laws against planting that sort of thing, but what can you do to encourage people to not plant things that really have nothing to do with Nantucket's natural environment?
I think, this one is where, again, it's landscapes and gardens. It's interesting because they really do go through sort of trends. And hydrangeas were trendy and still have been trendy. Someone decided Nantucket is a hydrangea means Nantucket. I think it's really about introducing to people just other palettes of plants, making it look beautiful. For me, I highly promote and advocate for native plants, but I also, when I look at a design, I also like to look at the ecological function, even of non-native plants. So if there are non-native plants that provide some sort of ecological function within the landscape, then I would use them. And I think as well there are non-natives that, you know, a peony. People love peonies. They're drought tolerant. They don't need fertilizer. I don't think they have much effect on pollinators, so they don't have much of an ecological function. Do they have a place in a garden? Yes. So I think it's about not being too extreme on one end, but really understanding what you're planting, why you're planting it. And I think when we're building, I'm working on a project right now where we are doing what would be a non-native, more garden area is in the back in a very contained area. But the rest of the house, what we're hoping to do is really piece back together the natural landscape that was there and make the house and the landscape feel much more integrated, aged together. And I think that's where there's a lot of scope for having your non-natives, having your gardens, but just reducing the size and then understanding, you know, putting the houses back into the landscape and using your natives there. I don't think there'll be regulations. A lot of it is education and then trends and trying to shift, again, people's perspective, perception, understanding of what landscapes are and can be.
Incentives, as you said.
Yeah.
And then there's the dump.
And then there's the dump.
Aren't you glad I brought that up?
I love the dump. I do. I mean, I love talking about garbage. I think that our dump is a major issue, major issue. And I think, you know, not everyone knows, but a lot of the issues that we're facing with our part and parcel, they have to do with the contract that we have. So in some ways we're limited, but I think we really have to do everything we can to make the dump as functional and have as minimal environmental impact as possible. I think as an island, we have to make this a priority. And, you know, I don't think we are.
You should have seen it 50 years ago.
Yeah, well, I think I can see it in the landfill that is being mined.
Yeah, and that didn't happen way back when. And, you know, there was a big, I don't know if you call it a hole, but that's where everybody's car got dumped. Mm-hmm. So it was unbelievable. Yeah. It was like you know, Mad Max or something.
And again, I think, you know, that's not necessarily unique to Nantucket. I saw it in my hometown, and, you know, you see dumps being closed, the landfills being closed. I mean, recycling is maybe the 90s. I know when Nantucket first, when we first redid the dump and the recycling, and the first couple of years of the contract, we were getting accolades from everywhere about what a great job we were doing. And I think that at the time, not having seen it myself, maybe we were. I remember even in 2003, I used to love going to the dump. And it's just deteriorated and deteriorated since then. And again, as an island with a growing population, and this is where, again, you really come back to environment and development, is that we're at that population level where we really have to take it seriously and really understand the impact each one of us has on the environment, and that's waste management, whether it's sewers or the dump. That's when we build, when we do anything, we have an impact, and we are enough people now where we have to take it very seriously. So, you know, and I think that you can get away with, everyone was getting away with just dumping old cars and paints and cans and everything into a hole when there were 10 people or when there were 50 people, but you reach that, what they would consider a carrying capacity. And once you've hit your carrying capacity where the environment can sort of absorb the impact, then you need to start engineering your way to increase that capacity. And that's what we're trying to do. And I think we need to do a much better job of doing it.
If you could wave a magic wand and get things done the way you want them to get done, what would you do?
Specific to the dump?
Well, specific to anything, really. It's a broad question.
I think one of the things, the magic wand waving, one of the things that I would love to be able to do is have taking our public outreach to an even higher level. I would love, in a perfect situation, if I could wave a magic wand, we had a community that felt like they could easily have their input into the governance and how things happen, and then going the other way, that the government would have the ability to explain why things are being done. I think there's so much conflict between public and government that just comes out of not communicating well. And I think that, again, is a universal problem. It's not just Nantucket, but I think that could be applied. So if I had a magic wand, I would definitely make that communication, that public outreach, the ability for people to engage, even better than what it is now.
You're lucky to have the annual town meeting. For all its flaws, I'd much rather have it than not have it. And we're steps ahead of other places just for that reason alone.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that is where, particularly being on Nantucket, I felt compelled or inspired to jump into politics here, because having grown up in upstate New York, where we don't have town meetings and we don't have board of selectmen, I've always felt very disconnected from the politics and your ability to be a part of it. And then having lived in Ireland, where your representatives have office hours every, once a month in the pub, and you can go and talk to them about anything, I felt much more connected to politics. And as I learned more about how things work in Nantucket, I felt like, you really can engage. You really can be a part of it. And town meetings are an incredible forum for understanding how one person's voice can really make a difference. And so, like you, although it's flawed, there probably is no perfect system, I do think we're very fortunate to have a system that is so engaging and allows us to be a part of it.
I agree. Rita Higgins, thank you for joining me today. Yeah. This has been fun and informative.
Same, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
For Coastal Matters, I'm Charlie Walters. Thank you for tuning in. Please tune in again next time.